our kind of a small bio from Dr. Sophie McClennen. She is the director for Center for Global Studies in Penn State, in Pennsylvania State University, as well as Latin American Studies program, and has ties with the departments of comparatively Spanish and Women's Studies. I would like to make emphasis that yesterday, for my surprise, it was a good presentation. I'm very happy to bring these topics to the forum, to the university center. And actually, I had these two feelings. You know, I was disappointed because half of the auditorium left. I don't know why. You know, it's something that is new for me. This is my third year. But I'm very happy to introduce her. And she is going to have this idea about globalization, social justice. I said just extracts for me, versus social injustice, arts and politics, how we are going to present our political statements, if we are creators or we are writers or we are critics. We cannot forget this peculiar angle that we have to be in practice in real society, not only in the university, but just this for my introduction. The topic is going to be about Latin American cinema and the ties or the implication with the so-called globalization. And I am open here to introduce Dr. Sophie McClennen, and you are happy to do some questions. Thank you.
Thank you. So this is a nice opportunity for me to talk about this book that I'm working on. And I got to go spend some sabbatical time in Buenos Aires in the spring, and a lot of that research kind of helped solidify what I'm going to argue in this book. And, you know, I've sort of started off trying to figure out what the connections were between globalization and culture. So at the basic level, this talk is really meant to pitch towards people who are worried about those problems, right? So I'm going to try to back up a bit because it may seem almost like I've dived into the middle of a conversation. But at the basic level, if you think about it, people have been worried about the impact of globalization on culture for quite some time. Arguably, in terms of contemporary scholarship, it became a major topic of concern starting around 1989 when, you know, we had the big shift in the Berlin Wall in the sense that, right, everything was changing and the West was unstoppable, right? So what happened was that I started to try to figure out what sorts of critical paradigms were being used to understand the dilemmas at the heart of this. And I've been, arguably I've been thinking about this book project for about 10 years. In the meantime, I've written other books, right? I've tried to, I keep playing with this topic, and I think I finally figured it out. And so that's exciting. And one of the, and so you'll see sort of what it is that I'm bothered by this. So this talk is really, what I'm doing is I'm pulling out what I expect to be sort of my introduction to this book I'm doing, which will have chapters on, two sections, one on production, distribution, and exhibition of cinema and the impact of globalization on that. And the second section will have chapters on Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico, which are the largest national film industries. It's not capacious. It's not as though I'm writing an entire chapter just on Brazil, for instance. That chapter really looks at violence and studies a series of films, right? Because otherwise it's not doable. It would be too superficial. So each of the chapters kind of takes an angle of those. But if you want to come or ask questions about that, I'd love to talk about it more. On August 30th, 2013, the historical connection between Latin American cinema and the United States underwent an unprecedented shift. For the first time in the history of U.S.-Mexico film exchange, a Mexican film was released in the U.S. market before ever being released inside Mexico. Not only were viewers from the North able to see the film before viewers in the national market from which the film hailed, but U.S. viewers flocked to see the film. In only 8 weeks, Instructions Not Included is already ranked as the 4th most successful foreign language film in the US box office. It's currently out. Hopefully you'll get to see it, right? And it's now the top ranked Spanish language film in US box office history, and exceeding what had been before it was El Laberinto del Fauno had been the top. Beyond the obvious appeal to Spanish speakers, the film has received significant support from the non-Spanish speaking market as well, an especially noteworthy fact since the film is a comedy, a genre traditionally considered to not cross borders well. In addition, it encapsulates the new global order of filmmaking. Pantaleon Films produced it, US-based Canadian-founded Lionsgate distributes it, and Chinese-owned AMC theaters, among others, are screening it. While obviously trend-setting, I'd like to suggest that this film symbolizes a process that's been a long time in the making. What it shows is that we're now in an era of globalization that demands entirely new critical frameworks through which to think about the key dilemmas that have preoccupied scholars of cultural globalization for decades. If we cluster the sorts of questions that have framed most research on culture and globalization, we can begin to note the critical oppositions that have tended to frame analysis of globalization's effects on culture no longer apply. While the list I have here is not exhaustive, it does cover the major sorts of threads that have structured inquiry into the effects of globalization on culture. What I want to do first is to map out these critical angles and explain what I mean by how they're not working anymore, and to trope on the title of the film I'm referencing, Today's Struggles Over Globalization and Culture Don't Include Instructions. And honestly, I was only just found out about this film as I was trying to map out my intro. But this is just the most perfect sort of historical serendipity that this movie is coming out right now. All right, so here's the first concept. This is the homogenization versus heterogeneity diversity. If you think about it, in the beginning, everybody was always worried that globalization was going to mean one big homogenous culture. Everybody eats McDonald's. This is a great conspiracy, right? For decades, scholars of Latin America have logically linked struggles with economic domination with those of cultural imperialism. Argentine economist Raul Prebisch argued in the 1950s against development economics, calling it dependency economics. While his counterparts in cinema, Fernando Solanas and Octavio Argentino, simultaneously called for developing a third cinema that would resist cultural and economic imperialism by creating images that would encourage viewers to be revolutionaries. At the time, resistance to US culture was understood as a viable and effective means for resisting US capitalism. So there was a synergy right there. Cultural struggles and economic struggles were seen as inextricably intertwined, and protectionist practices prevailed as strategies for resistance. So the idea was the way you protect, the way you fix this problem is you don't let the West come in economically or culturally. But today that's no longer the case under the market diversification strategies of neoliberal capitalism. In fact, if anything, the reverse is true. Neoliberalism encourages the consumption of culture from diverse locations for the simple reason that it helps drive profits. It wants to market non-Western culture in the West, just as it wants to market Asian culture in Latin America and vice versa. Right? So this is one of the fundamental issues at the heart of what makes this different, is that neoliberalism likes diversity. And so it's very hard to consider diversity to be outside of that, when they would love it if we buy every single DVD out there, right? They don't want us to only buy Titanic. This means that the political efficacy of promoting and supporting non-Western culture in the West can have the unintended consequence of simply bolstering the power of neoliberal capital. What was once a political act for Argentino and Solanas, the promoting of a political film from Latin America, may instead be helping make the Disney Corporation more money. Once diversity is a marketing category, it complicates the long-standing view that diversity is inherently a progressive, political, and powerful tool tool to fight imbalances of power. All right, here's my next framework. So cultural imperialism versus local or autochthonous culture, right? This is, you know, we've grappled with this as Latin Americanists constantly, right? A related yet separate issue is connected to the notion that one way to challenge geopolitical inequity is through the valorization and appreciation of the local and the autochthonous over the foreign, especially when the foreign is associated with a neo-imperial source. So again, there's a sense that there's a connection between the power and the culture. Similar to the argument for diversity as an antidote to cultural domination, this argument values the local over the global. But in terms of commercially released films, such arguments get very messy, since it's difficult to fight for the cultural value of a Latin American film as fundamentally superior to a Hollywood film in all cases. What happens, for instance, when we compare films like Mexican director Alfonso Cuarón's highly political film Children of Men, which was shot in Great Britain, starred Clive Owen and produced by Universal Pictures, or Brazilian director Fernando Meirelles' The Constant Gardener, produced by Focus Features, starring Ralph Fiennes, shot in Berlin and Kenya, alongside Mauricio Wallerstein's Mexican-funded, gratuitously violent narco film, Travesía del Desierto, right? I mean, and there's so much of this stuff, right? The point is that the markers of autochthonous and foreign, i.e. Western, do not always demarcate a clear hierarchy between films with content supportive of or damaging to Latin American identities. If autochthonous at one time signaled a cultural form that was inherently more valuable and more progressive, that's no longer the case. And in a sort of longer version of this, I also talk about the kind of idea that we had that the local could be outside of capital, right? Which also doesn't really work anymore, right? This is going back a lot to the arguments about testimonio and the value of those kinds of cultural projects. All right, so then the next one is this question of U.S. market dominance. The worry over Hollywood and U.S. domination of the media industry has driven concerns about market access for non-U.S. based companies for decades. Again, the correlation between Hollywood, the United States, and a global system of structural inequity meant that those fighting for media access often packaged their critiques in a geographical framework that intertwined the U.S. with a closed commercial system. While much of the legal framework that privileges U.S. product in the global marketplace still remains in place, it's increasingly the case that the top media providers globally are not U.S.-based. The production company for Instructions Not Included, Pantaleon Films, is a collaboration between Mexican Televisa and Canadian-founded Lionsgate, the #1 independent film production company and the 7th most profitable film studio in the world. In a recent ranking of global media groups, Mexico's Televisa ranked 18, and Brazilian Globo ranked 17, with the top spot, of course, going to Google. Argentine Grupo Clarín ranked 30th alongside the Finnish Sanoma Corporation. While the top 5 spots in global media production are still occupied by US-based companies, that hegemony has been destabilized completely in the realm of movie theater chains, which is a big part of the story of cinema, right? It's not just who's making the movies, but who's showing them, right? The top movie theater chain, AMC, is owned by Chinese Dalian Wanda Group, and the 4th largest movie chain in the world is Mexican-based Cinépolis, which was the first international company to open theaters in India. It's the only foreign film chain in India, not the Chinese, not the US. Again, the point here is that the overlap between Hollywood, the United States, and the exercise of economic power is being strained by the realities of a neoliberal market that's made it possible for major players to emerge from regions that have previously been marginalized. If a Mexican media mogul, Carlos Slim, can be the richest man in the world, and if a Latin American nation like Brazil can have the 6th largest economy in the world, we are certainly witnessing an era where the geographies of economic power are shifting. Okay, I got more. Hollywood aesthetic dominance. Debates over cultural politics in Latin America in the 1960s and 70s connected a Hollywood aesthetic with capitalist ideology and with filmmaking that served as a distraction rather than as a way to raise audience awareness of major social issues. This was the basic idea, right? That if you watched Hollywood, you were just being brainwashed and distracted and made more stupid. The idea at the time was that truly political films needed a new aesthetic, one that did not replicate Hollywood styles, since those styles would support US ideology and would frustrate any progressive politics in the region. The films that emerged in that time period as antidotes to Hollywood were often highly complex, layered films. I'm thinking of like Glauber Rocha movies, also the Cubans, Tomas Gutierrez Alea, that kind of stuff, right? As we look back on those aesthetic innovations, we note that regardless of the intent of the filmmakers, their products were largely unintelligible to their intended audiences. Instead, they were primarily consumed by Latin American, US, and European elites. The debate over aesthetics and cultural politics is a rich one, and with many varied approaches to the dilemma, but it's now possible to identify a series of political films from Latin America that use versions of Hollywood aesthetics as a way to promote politically engaged storylines to broad audiences. Films like Brazilian Fernando Meirelles' City of God, while criticized for using a sensationalist aesthetic, was instrumental in raising Brazilian attention to problems of poverty and crime, and much the same was true for Argentine Pablo Trapero's White Elephant. I mean, arguably, the debate, what Meirelles said was the debate you're having over whether or not this film is doing a good job of representing poverty is proving the point that my film is helping you talk about poverty, right? So there was a lot of energy around that film and debate discussion, right? To further complicate matters, what we now often consider to be a Hollywood aesthetic has itself been created by artists from outside of the US, a fact that's historically plagued the use of the term Hollywood aesthetic. If there ever was one that you could connect to directors associated with US culture, that connection is even harder to draw now. When we strip away the geographical metaphors used to engage in aesthetic debates, we are able to let go of the idea that commercially successful, visually slick cinema is solely produced in Hollywood. I mean, I could bring in some pretty cool Asian examples too, but I guess I'm not going to. All right, next one. National culture versus a global. So thus the ties between economic domination and cultural domination don't easily map to the geographies that framed debates in the 60s and 70s, or to the deconstructions that shaped much critical rethinking of those geographies in the 80s and 90s. In fact, today neither the post-colonial maps nor the post-structural unmappings seem to adequately account for the key struggles shaping cultural production. If at one time it was possible to use a core periphery model for both cultural and economic power, we now find that model won't work. Similarly, if at one time deterritorializing culture seemed like a progressive act, such unmoorings have now been shown to serve pervasive structures of power. Take, for example, the case of Argentina, one of the few film industries in the region to hold to a quota system for film screenings in its theaters. One data point reveals that in 2012, almost 40% of all films released in Argentina were Argentine. That sounds impressive, right? But some digging reveals that those films only captured 9.4% of viewers. So they're counting numbers of films that got released. That doesn't tell you much because you need to know who saw them and how long they were in the theaters. So, again, this research is fascinating because you start to see how for the Argentines, they love to brag. We released 40% of films, right? Then you have to. To further complicate matters, one of the top Argentine production companies, Patagonic Films, doesn't sound any more Argentine than Patagonic, right? Is partially owned by Disney and was also previously part owned by Spanish media conglomerate Telefónica. One of their most internationally successful films was Oscar-nominated El Hijo de la Novia, which was directed by Juan Jose Campanella, a graduate of the NYU Film School, who regularly works for US TV shooting episodes of House. So, given these realities, right, a film which is being presented as Argentine, but which is funded from Spain and Disney, right, and is directed by someone who's got his foot pretty squarely in the US media business, you know, we want to call it Argentine. So this is fascinating, and it's always been true that we've had some of this, but now it's just much more extreme, right? So, given these realities, how are we to measure the strength of national cinema against Hollywood cinema? We think that that's an opposition. We kind of can expose that that's not, doesn't make sense. All right, so, and yet another one. The last framework I have time to cover concerns the thought that exposure to other cultures, this is kind of gets to the diversity question that we were talking about. Exposure to other cultures would help create a greater sense of global connectedness, respect for diversity, and multicultural appreciation. We're now in a really good place to start reassessing the effects of multiculturalism and diversity as it was practiced, right? Some 30 years after the push for multiculturalism of the 80s, and 50 years after struggles for civil rights, we're now able to assess the consequences of these projects. What we can now find is that diverse cultures are consumed, but not valued. This is why the rise in the consumption of salsa, which is overtaking ketchup as the top-selling condiment in the United States, does not indicate a rise in respect for Latinos. Or why the increase in public visibility of people of color, most notably in the election of Barack Obama, has not translated into income equity across the racial divide. Or why more diverse reading lists in college courses have not led to less people of color in prison. On the contrary, despite the success of cultural diversity as a cultural project, these gains have not transformed social inequity in the era of neoliberal biopolitics. The facts are overwhelming. We have more ethnic conflict than at any other time since the turn of the 20th century. We have greater income disparity across people of color, more anti-immigrant violence, and higher rates of incarceration of blacks and Latinos. We currently have more African American males in prison than we ever had as slaves. Will Kimlicka worries at the increase of ethnocultural conflict concurrent with the rise in identity politics. So, you know, whether you want to say the one led to the other, it doesn't really matter about cause and effect. It matters that it's not helping ameliorate the problem, right? So he says, working with data, this is Kimlicka, working with data on the global escalation of cultural violence, he contends that, quote, since the end of the Cold War, ethnocultural conflicts have become the most common source of political violence in the world, and they show no sign of abating. So, if all of these critical structures no longer work as guiding frameworks through which to think about the central concerns of globalization and culture, what are we to do? Because despite the fact that I've drawn out examples of how many of the critical guides we used to use are no longer valid, I don't mean to suggest that we are no longer living in an era where questions of access, equity, dignity, and value are no longer at stake, right? So I'm not going to leave you completely depressed. My research shows that the historical convergence between both a geography and a politics of power has often led to efforts to provide more accurate mappings and ethnographies, while also often deconstructing or destabilizing the maps, right? So it was one, let's make a better map, two, let's destabilize the map. But both gestures, better, more nuanced maps, and deconstructed geographies, don't really help get at the heart of the questions that many of us find most troubling about globalization and culture. And as I've shown, they don't hold up against the actual realities of global culture. Consequently, I argue that a turn to ethics, especially one that derives from a critique of neoliberal biopolitics, reveals a need to move from an emphasis on the location of culture to the ethics of culture. What happens if the questions we ask about culture and globalization begin from an ethical critique of neoliberal free market policies and ideologies, rather than from efforts to find ever more accurate geographical mappings? Such an approach allows us to avoid the pitfalls of making claims that attach the location of culture to its redemption, or that envision hybridity, transculturalism, or other sorts of regraphings as antidotes for social inequity. If I had more time, I would trace through all the implications of this approach and demonstrate its value for a new model for understanding cultural globalization, but I'm assuming we can talk about my solutions over lunch. That's it.
It's good. Good. It's a lot of ideas, a lot of points to discuss. You are open to make a question, or I can just submit one. Just to anyone.
I'm curious. Feels to me that this is a vision of the issue from the United States, right? How people in, I don't know, Argentina, Brazil, or some other places, cities when they see movies that so-called are Mexican or Brazilian or Argentinian become a success.
Well, right, no, I mean, because I have done on-the-ground research in Mexico and Argentina and Peru, so I have a pretty good take on that. So what you're asking me is, do Argentine people feel proud when their films are globally successful?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. But that's also the same would be when they win a soccer match or any other, I mean, as you well know, nationalism is not unique to the United States. Every nation has nationalism. Every nation likes to be proud. Do I have any Peruvians in the room? You're from Peru.
Yeah.
I mean, Peru is fascinating because I mostly focused my research on Grupo Chasqui.
Oh, okay.
So, I mean, I met with all of those directors. I met with the actors. I met with which was arguably one of the most successful sort of social justice, massively popularly mobilized film events in Peruvian history. You have other filmmakers that sort of did top-down stuff, but they really they did it, right? And they're still working on lots of really fascinating projects. Oh yeah. Well, they made a documentary that came out in 2010. But their big thing they're doing is they do small collective community film screenings things. So they try to teach people how they can. It's a cool thing. Anyway, but one of the reasons, of course, why Peru doesn't have a super successful feature film market is because they didn't protect themselves. And of course, as you know, they imported a lot of Mexican cinema, which they don't do really now. Now it's just Hollywood, right? And then occasionally something Peruvian. But they had cortos, right? They had the ley de cortos. One of the things that Peru did is if you were going to show a foreign film, you had to show a short that was Peruvian before it, which meant that you had a whole chunk of Peruvian filmmakers that were really good at the short form, which is a very neat thing and also makes you good for advertising. So those people all had good jobs. But then they got rid of the ley de cortos, so they don't have anything to really protect the film industry. But in any case, so going back to this question, like, what is the ongoing value of being proud of a cultural product? I mean, so what I'm trying to say is, rather than assume that that is going to be necessarily a good thing, right? We would start to ask that question from the perspective of an ethical dilemma, right? So what is the ethical dilemma? Peruvians don't feel proud enough, they don't take pride in their culture. If they were to take pride in their culture, what would that look like? As you know, I mean, Peru is a complex country. So one of the things that I worry about is having this, like, I don't know if you saw it, like La Denusa, right? And I think that's some really awful cinema in my mind, right? So that's just so depressing that that's, in any case, so.
People were very proud of that movie.
They were proud because of that, but it's very, very, very disrespectful to indigenous people. Like, it's so bad, I can barely speak about it. It's so bad. Now, believe me, we'll tell you the plot lines and you'll be like, oh my God. Because if a gringo had made that movie, there'd be Peruvians trying to kill him, right? That's how outrageous it is. But so what I'm trying to say is that to have this concept that you would make a cultural product that would necessarily make the whole culture proud is sort of nuts anyway. I mean, that's just about nationalism, and nationalism has its benefits, but it also has its risks. So, you know, I'm not really, this goes back to questions on quotas and what we want to do. It's tricky because you can have films that will become internationally successful but are disrespectful movies. Mare Nusa is a really good example, right? That's a film that's, it would be, it's unfortunate, right? So what would happen if we started thinking more about, we would rather be advocating for films that treated human beings with respect, right? So that's that dilemma. That what I'll end up concluding in this project is not that it doesn't matter where the cultural product comes from at all, right? That some sort of boundary of attempting to value something different doesn't matter. It's just that it will only matter at the service of a larger ethical project. And nationalism is a very tricky thing to just blanket out say you want to support. Because it's, in the case of Peru, it means, you know, the whole indigenous community is sort of left out of it. I mean, Mexico is a great story. One of the classic examples is the film LBO Name, which is a beautiful, amazing film, and the Mexicans wouldn't let it be released because, you know, it deals with Chiapas and stuff like that. So, you know, what Mexico wants to export is something that at the end serves the state. And so we're, unsurprisingly, all of these internationally successful Latin American films don't massively disrupt the state. The one that was really fascinating that got to people was the one, the Mexican one where they go after the PRI.
La Ley de Herodes?
Yeah, La Ley de Herodes, which is a really good movie. I saw it in Guadalajara, and everyone in the theater was like, oh, we're all going to be in trouble for watching this movie, because when it had first come out, everyone, they'd never seen a feature film that attacked the PRI as, you know, totally, corrupt. But anyway, so, you know, generally speaking, you don't have those films. They are not the ones that pop. So they're the films that, you know, reinforce the status quo at some level, right?
I would like to add a commentary, if possible. It's not only in foreign films, also in Hollywood industry, because I want to recall a case. For example, A Day After Tomorrow. When
that's really good.
When you see, just a commentary. I saw the film in Orange County, and when they had the scene where the U.S. Citizens are crossing illegally the border to Mexico, trying to rescue, survive, it was a brutal silence in the cinema. People don't like that scene because they see that is a kind of parody or kind of something that they don't understand. I want to make this point because it's not LBO Name, it's not all those films, great films that we have now from different countries. That when you said the problem is the distribution, and the problem is what is the motive that they hide those production or they seclude it, because you cannot talk about The Day After Tomorrow because some people get offended very easily. It's happening in Hollywood industry. For example, this new film, Gravity, just coming back to your point. I am from Mexico, but I am a citizen of this planet. If you see the film, we are working against myths and logos. Means like the imagination versus reality. And people miss that point because they think that it's, some scientists from NASA say, oh no, this is not because it's not the physics, it's not acting like the details about the direction of the travel, of the satellites, everything. But the point is that they don't see what's on the film to create and to educate people. That is the point I want to ask you when you said that neoliberalism lies diversity because I have problems. Could you extend that point?
Yeah, I mean, you know, the film to talk about is Children of Men.
Yeah.
That was $100 million budget.
Same Gravity.
Right. Well, let's see. Gravity should do well, right?
Yeah.
Children of Men was $100 million budget. It is, unlike Gravity, a very, let's say, subtle critique of neoliberalism, the post 9/11 terror state, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's the gloves are off in that film. So how do you raise $100 million to make a film that basically says the global neoliberal biopolitical system is a disaster, right? You do it because they don't care. See, that's the difference between the Cold War era capitalists and the post-1989 neoliberals who don't care, really. The people who are trying to make money in the media industry just want to make money.
Good.
They don't actually think that you're going to make a movie that will change the world anyway. They don't care. They want an event, right? They want this, they want that. So what, I mean, the good news is they don't care, so they'll fund projects. I find it really fascinating to see neoliberal capital financing films critical of neoliberal capital. But it's constant now. It's so much more pervasive. It just means that that whole fantasy we had, again, this is as much a story about me, hitting a certain moment in my life where I'm like, all of the paradigms I was trained in don't work anymore.
Right.
I was trained in the, venceremos, right? And we're going to push back on you guys, and we're rejecting you, and but this isn't the world it is now. It's just not. And I mean, again, I've talked to the directors. But believe me, Grupo Chasky, where they get their money from now? European philanthropists.
They used to get money from the board.
But they're not now. But you know what I'm saying? So, yeah.
I had a couple of points. I found this idea of where your concluding idea of this focus on ethics really interesting. I mean, in a certain way, there is something in common with the new cinema movements. I mean, they were certainly concerned with ethics there.
Right. It's sort of pulling that out as the primary ground as opposed to the.
But historically, there's this Argentine-born director, Tom Paine, who made films for the Veracruz studios in the 50s in Brazil. And that, actually, Veracruz was like a Brazilian attempt to make a Hollywood in Sao Paulo. But with native, it was not like it was cultural imperialism. They were attempting to do native stories.
Right.
But then they also used all of these, foreign technical crews and like international,
Right.
More Brazilian cast, but international technical crews, and financed by Sao Paulo industry. And that director, Tom Paine, said all cinema is international. He was saying that in the 50s, like he thought the idea of cinema was an international idea. And then if you go over, you can find it with other Latin American countries too, but if you go across, certainly since the silent era, you've had all kinds of international influence of genre and that kind of thing in cinema. And of course, we have the same thing with literature going back, into previous centuries. So I guess I wanted to bring up the historical point of, you focused on as a comparison in terms of, imperialism. You focused on some of the new cinema people like La Rocha, or that were very much wanted to combat Hollywood imperialism. But we could go, you could go further back in history in Brazil. From the 30s to the 50s, the chanchada genre
Right, but
was totally
Rocha
different.
thought all that was really bad cinema. I mean, so yes, I mean, look, believe me, I get
No,
this.
he did. I'm just saying
But,
that if we wanted to trace a longer history, we could say there were different attitudes about foreign influence over the century of cinema, and so how much are we? Do you think maybe we've returned to this era where there's less?
Okay, so
you
I
said
can answer
we've
this
returned.
question for you because it's actually not that complicated. So the thing is that as you mentioned, like literature or anything else, it's the story of cinema as uniquely national versus international is a long and complicated story. It really begins at the very first films, which can be moved around and shown in other locations because they're silent, blah, blah, blah. I mean, that story is, so the story of it as they develop a national context versus trading over, and the fact that the film stock, the cameras, the training, etc., was always a lot of that was exchanged among people and almost never wholly contained in any national space. I mean, so that's always been true. And it's a complex story, like scholars, cinema scholars who work on like the history of national cinemas can tell you about the ins and outs of all those details. But at the very basic level, there's something that changes in what we call the moment of the majors, right? Once you have the major motion picture producers, that happens in the United States with the development, right, of the Hollywood studio system, and in Brazil with the, you know, again, the Veracruz system there. Mexico had its own version, and so did Argentina, right? So some of the Latin American countries also tried to develop their own major film industry in-house, etc. Other countries didn't run with that, right? It's a response to that commercialization and production of film like that then leads the 60s and 70s directors to try to work outside of it. So they're really doing two things. They're trying to be independent of the systems that were in place already in their countries, because it's not surprising that all of those great, you know, Nuevo Cine people often were already working out of countries that had a pretty impressive film history. You do have Grupo Gamao in Bolivia. Bolivia did not have a major film industry, but generally, right, those directors were from Cuba, they're from Argentina, they were from Brazil, you know, we had Mexico, right? So it's not surprising. So they were really rejecting two things. They're rejecting the national production of product that they saw as massively commercialized and pro-nationalist in terrible ways, at the same time that they were rejecting Hollywood. And they kind of dovetailed them together through the radical politics.
But there was also the international influence of, you know, like direct cinema and Italian neorealism.
Absolutely.
And all of those, like the Brazilian
Yeah, so
directors
I have a
were
whole
incorporating all
chapter
that.
on co-production where I do exactly that. I do it through the case of Cuba, and I talk about, it's pretty fascinating during the Cuban Revolution. You know, after the revolution, when they established ICAIC, Tomás Gutiérrez Alea is going to go to the Centro Experimentale in Rome to edit his films. And everyone just thinks that's fine. But once Spain is now a co-producer on a Cuban film, it's horrible, right? So the answer to the like, I have a whole chapter on the idea that these films have always been produced in an international context. But when do we notice it? When do we care about it? When does it seem like a manipulation, right, and an imposition on a national culture? And it seems to come in conjunction with capitalism, right, with some sort of attempt to control the market and that concern about ideology, right? So
When do they, you're saying when do those countries notice it? or
no, when
respond
do
to
the
it?
critics
Oh,
care?
okay.
Right? The critics care when they think that the collaboration brings with it a particular ideology that's problematic, right? Because as we've both discussed, the idea that you're going to have a purely national product in the case of a film, given that, I mean, Grupo Chasqui is a really good example too, because Stefan Kaspar, right, is European, Alejandro Legazpi is Argentine. I mean, so these guys, nobody gets all worked up about the fact that one of the most famous Peruvian film collectives was, you know, had two primary directors that were not Peruvian. Why? Because they think the project was, you know, in solidarity. So what I want to do in that chapter is show that there's a reason why those anxieties show up at specific times. Because even the history of the Chao, like those films had, as you point out, a lot of foreign influence too.
Yeah, they were
So-
doing versions of Hollywood
Blah, blah, blah,
films or
right, yeah, yeah.
parodying them.
That was all over the place. But the issue is when do people have anxieties? The anxiety of co-production, right?
regarding anxieties about Hollywood influence, you do have some of these guys responding to a real, like a director like Carlos Dieguez. He was part of the Cinema Nova movement, did some of these very kind of independent auteurist films in the 60s. And then he still, like in the last decade, was complaining about the economic situation of Brazilian cinema in Brazil. So that was something that I wanted to just, insert into the economic discussion, because you portrayed it more as I didn't get a sense of as much of the hierarchy that exists in this, structure of globalization, which I think maybe in something like music, maybe it's less than cinema. But in cinema, you still have, I think anyone here who's been in a Latin American country can see, if you go to one of those theaters, like 8 out of 10 films will be U.S. Productions, like major, not always, usually big studio production, not always. Sometimes they're independent films, but in a Brazilian cinema, like the standard mall cinema, you will have definite dominance of English language, often Hollywood produced films. So we still have this situation where there's clearly not as much space for a Brazilian film.
Well, right, but I mean, I can tell you though that it's driven by market. So if the Brazilians go to see the Brazilian films, then they'll be in the theater. So that's part of it that, I mean, like I said, Argentina's sort of held to a quota system. I don't actually know whether Brazil's using a quota system right now or not.
They have some level of, like, certain amount of time you have to open up for Brazil.
Well, like Mexico does box office revenue. So if you don't hit a certain box office revenue, you're booted out. So you can get into the theater, but if you don't go see your film, you're gone. So that's the thing, is that, again, from the perspective of how we talk about culture and power, it's like, well, we're talking about a far more complicated issue than exhibition of films, right? So so in the realm of like what you're thinking about with film, first we have to make the movie, and we have to distribute the movie, then it has to show up in a theater. Once it shows up in the theater, we have to get people to go see it. And I've talked to directors that talk a lot about the issues that they have with advertising, right? It's a increasingly big deal, because they don't have the same kinds of advertising budgets as like a Hollywood film, so they can't get the energy around their film at the same level, right? So they feel like they're at a competitive disadvantage. But again, like what you're describing, I mean, that is just a fact, right? No dispute there. You and I agree. We both know it's just true. Hollywood is about 80% of the Latin American market.
Yeah,
But some of that will be gravity. Do you see what I'm saying? Some of it's going to be gravity, and some of it's going to be the constant gardener, and some of it's going to be starting to get complicated.
Just sort of as an inertia, like this is something that's changing. I mean, that's like this director Dieguez wrote about this and said it's kind of like, well, you have hundreds of films being shipped abroad by Hollywood every year, which dwarfs all of these other countries in Latin America, how many films they're producing. So to a certain extent, it's like if you're at the supermarket and you're going to buy soap and there's hundreds of boxes of soap and one down here is Brazilian, and they're continually sending new boxes to replace the old ones that get sold. It's much harder for someone to purchase the Brazilian box of soap. He kind of uses that metaphor.
So if we take a minute and think about this is exactly kind of the heart of these debates about culture and globalization. It's the entire marketplace is saturated, let's say, in case of film with Hollywood product, right? So if there's 8 Hollywood movies for every 2 Brazilian movies, that's just not fair, right? That's bad, and it's bad for Brazil. That was the argument. But as I'm trying to show, those 20% of the 2 films out of, so you have 10 movies, 8 are from Hollywood, 2 are from Brazil. What if one of the 2 films is a raunchy, sexist, obnoxious film. Like, it's not clear what we're thinking about here that we want to save. One.
Right.
Okay? The second thing is that, so do you see what I'm saying? Is that if we think the ethical dilemma of the saturation of Hollywood in the Brazilian market is solved by just saying, well, we'll have 3 Brazilian films and only 7, or whatever, you're wrong, because the chances are that of the 3 films that are going to be Brazilian, Disney funded half of them anyway. Do you care? And what if the Brazilian films are outrageously offensive movies? Do you care? Because that's what the quote in the different part of the paper, I talk about what I call quota think. Quota think doesn't address the ethical dilemma. Like, we agree about the ethical problem. We agree about what we don't like, but the question is, how do you fix it?
Yeah.
What if you fixed
They've been trying to figure it out then.
Well, right, but they've been trying to figure it out, I think, in a way that still figures that the solution is to mark something as Brazilian, and that the marking of the thing as Brazilian is an antidote to Hollywood.
Yeah, there are alternative debates within, like the question, I've heard the question asked multiple times this year in the media in Brazil as, why does Brazilians only like comedies? Why are the most successful Brazilian films like slapstick comedies in the last few years? And there's a lot of, there's worry amongst directors who do not make comedies as to how do we get people to watch dramas in Britain, so there is debate about what's going on with those 2 films.
Meanwhile, Brazil is kicking television butt. So in the realm of media production, right, it's hard to paint Brazil as a loser in the global cultural exchange. Talk to Peru. You see what I'm saying? Like, again, this is another thing I don't bring up here, but I'm like, if we look at one of the problems we have when we're Latin Americanists is we talk about Latin America versus the West, or if you're in Brazil, but again, within the regional dynamics, it's like, talk to Paraguay. I mean, who is losing?
Well,
Who's consuming?
TV is a big,
But
that's a
listen
new
to
thing,
me.
certainly.
But the thing is that Brazilian culture is internationally consumed, right? Peru's lucky it's got the pan flute, right? So the point is that there's a big difference. Mexican culture is totally hegemonic. If you think about it in certain structures, as is Brazilian. Both the Brazilian and Mexican culture have massive hegemonic roles they play throughout the region. Big time, big time. So, it destabilizes the map when you start to go, yeah, the Chileans are struggling, right? Because they don't have the infrastructure Argentina has, or whatever. So when you start to understand how it's happening across these nations, and you realize, yeah, Brazil has a fight to pick with Hollywood, but within
this is interesting.
the
That's kind of
region,
what I was trying to tease
but
out, like
within
what
the
is
region-
historically unique that's coming out.
but within the region, Brazil is a winner. And so understanding, and so imagining, so one of the things that troubled me was the consequence of always painting Brazil as a victim of globalization. I'm like, that's insane. It's TV Globo is number 17 in the most powerful media producers in the world. That's not too bad, right?
Yeah, well, obviously that's more recent than new cinema. The
Well, that was a
TV,
different thing. But needless, and what are they getting? What exactly is making them so powerful? Really offensive telenovelas. So this is the thing. I mean, this is the whole kind of attachment of the cultural ethos with a place to a global problem, right? It's like, well, guess what? Neoliberal capital has really changed the stakes on this. It's very hard to say something from Brazil is just inherently better than something from the United States. That's crazy now. That's not going to be true. Would it come back to producing some nationalism? I'm like, okay, but I don't really think Brazil has a problem with nationalism. I don't think it needs more. I don't think it's at risk. Just, oh, and here's the other piece of it, I don't talk about this as much, but Jesus Martin Barbero, right, who's the Colombian media critic, he has some very compelling research, right? He says, look, if it were true that consuming things from, the United States and Colombia would destroy Colombian identity, it'd be gone by now. It'd be over. So all of that anxiety we had, that everyone was going to watch this movie and listen to this song and blah, 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 and we would no longer be who we were, isn't working because obviously it's mediaciones, right? Everybody's mediating that viewing experience through
Or
their own,
anthropophagia.
or whatever. So,
Cannibalism.
but it's been decades now. It's been decades, and it's not that you don't have unique identities across nations, across regions and nations, etc. So, the good news is that, yeah, I mean, is it probably disturbing that people in Colombia are listening to Miley Cyrus and thinking about figuring out the Spanish word for twerking? Yes, but it's just as disturbing to me that I have to think about it in the U.S. So, I mean, those anxieties, again, that I think came out of worries that globalization was going to lead to cultural homogenization, that's just not true.
Well, can we,
I was just
we
gonna say
we have
one-
a moment for one question, and
I was just going to respond that one unique thing that I feel like maybe is a different response than previous generations is these directors like Morellis who they say, oh, let me jump into the international market, or Walter Salles, or Enter Dalida. There's lots of people who have said, I'm going to go to Hollywood and try to make a film there, rather than
But they come
I'm
back and
participating
forth.
in that.
Yeah,
Right.
they come back and forth, which is, that was not the previous model.
Right.
I mean, you have, right, so you have this group of directors from the 60s and 70s that were amazing, but then you have another group that's in play now, right? You have Salles and you have Cuarón, and these guys they're setting a completely different model for what it means to be like a Latin American director with a political message to make. I mean, sure, like Cuarón does like The Little Princess, okay, whatever. But at the end of the day, he still has a baseline, kind of politics behind the film projects he wants to do, and he stays pretty true to that.
one thing that I want to add is that is the thing that caught again my attention, the ethics, aesthetics, and politics, because we cannot forget the idea that we work, for example, myself in literature, but I'm working in cinema too, and I like the architecture, and we see that everything is changing. We cannot apply role models or old concepts. I think I don't know if that's the question for you. I mean, a commentary question, because I think we need to see that the force that is taking place now, so-called globalization or neoliberalism, because at the end, the product is going to have a reception, and that's the important thing. Besides that it's a success or not, in my idea or in my work, I can see that everything has to change. We learn from the past, but we cannot live in the past or use the same kind of the attitudes or same kind of the politics. And I think it's a proof to show, and I want just to make a commentary about the violin. I met with Francisco Vargas in Mexico, and we had just a small talk because it was a great film, but it was censorship. Again, it's a totalitarian regime that is in Mexico now, and it's awful. He has a wonderful project, and I try to participate, and it's banned. It's the impression at that point is unbelievable.
Right. So
He is no Cuarón because it's new director.
But LBO Name is a much more disruptive film to the vision of Mexico, right? So that was
Yep.
why. I mean, so, we can kind of keep this conversation going over lunch, but I think the key thing to take away from this is that I believe that it's not that we won't keep asking some of the same questions, and it's not that we won't keep thinking about some similar types of solutions, like how do you protect the Brazilian market against Hollywood? But if you imagine that you're always keeping those ethical concerns about what kinds of things are being made, are these films promoting dignity, are they promoting equity, are they promoting open access, etc., whatever types of questions are matter to you, because I'm not going to tell you what they should be, I do think that we will get away from this idea that just because it was made in Brazil makes it better, right? Especially when we know that actually it was not even completely made in Brazil. So.
I have one comment. Globalization is generally terrifying to people. The average person doesn't want that. You know what? Listen to the texts you hear on television and radio now, and read the newspapers. They don't want globalization. To protect my terrible. The situation is really drastically bad. We're willing to fight wars for 12 years.
Right.
With no consequence at all as a result of the outcome. Stupid.
Right.
Stupid.
I mean, one of the things is that with the markets fully deregulated, people don't recognize that you can make a cultural product that seems to be connected to a place.
Yes.
But the entire ways in which it can get made and moved around are radically different than what they used to be. And so that's part of this, you know, what I'm trying to get at is that it's certain version of unfettered market capital that comes in after 1989 really changes the stakes, and cinema is one of the best ways to see that.
Yep, that's true.
You know, one of the best books I've read on this is a guy, William Robinson, who's a sociologist, called Latin American Global Capitalism. And he traces, you know, what exactly happens when there's no place for primitive accumulation anymore. I mean, everything is rendered in terms of the market. So isn't our beef really with market mentalities? At the end of the day, right? I mean, sure, we want to promote or whatever. I mean, again, I'm really ambivalent about nationalism. But market mentalities are arguably the most devastating, right? Actor today in terms of human life, right? So if you really say you care about social justice, then you do have to stop and think about whether or not this question of Latin America versus the West is the way to think about it, or should we frame it differently? And one of the books that I rely a lot on is Nancy Fraser's Scales of Justice, right? So the idea is that the grievance has to be understood in the right geopolitical framework in which the grievance is produced. So if you have a grievance in the sense of like, I have a population in a country that is marginalized and suffering, how do you solve that if you don't recognize that the reason why that population is marginalized and suffering is a global problem, in fact, right? So you scale the search for justice according to the origin of the injustice. So in this case, if our beef is with neoliberal capital, then our beef is global. And so our solution can't be local. That's part of what I'm trying to get at. All right.
Thank you very much.
Kind of make some announcements of future events. There's going to be a lunch at Teller's, to which you're all invited. And that's, Teller's up on Broadway. That's going to happen 12 o'clock, so we're going to go up there. That runs from 12 to 1. And I just want to add that the whole Peace Studies program, that, the rationale of it is to have a discussion about neoliberalism, capitalism, and globalism across departments. That is the function of Peace Studies, period. And
we want to call it opening the academic commons.
Exactly. And we are so sheltered in disciplines, and it's crazy because we're all talking about the same issues. Romance languages, sociology, a little bit in political science, and English film studies, and we're all fighting these battles in our departments. It's the same battle. It's the same issues. And we've tried to reorient Peace Studies so it's really about the faculty research that is really pretty amazing. Not only, at MU, so much is going on.
Everywhere.
It's to make people aware of that cross-disciplinary stuff at MU, and also to connect with similar thinkers around the world, and in various disciplines. So what we've had this semester is that, and I know many of you couldn't attend, Ted Kodachek, who's professor of history, gave an excellent talk about neoliberalism and empire from the point of view of the English empire, which he studies, and the transition in modes of empire that occurred in the middle of the 19th century. And it's a wonderful book that he's produced, and I recommend it to all of you. This talk certainly continues the dialogue. And the last slide, I think, is a real wake-up call for us to discuss things in a certain way. I want to plug my own talk, which happens in November, which is precisely about the ethical basis of elite and mass politics, and how in the United States, the values of social democracy and equality kind of got subverted by elites into doctrines of fairness, which is a watered down. So I start with Fraser and talk about how those real ethical concerns are watered down in political discourse into a discourse about fairness. And it kind of touches with what you were saying last night about diversity programs and how the discourse gets shifted to something that no longer maintains the ethical push. My whole argument is going to be that doctrines of fairness were developed in response to socialist opposition, and it happened in two moments. One was during the Progressive Era, and these doctrines led to Progressive Era type regulations of the economy that strengthened capitalism. And I argue the same thing happens today with the Obama period. That instead of dealing with issues of equality, he tries to, kind of speak to the issues of Occupy by a notion of fairness, which led to some of the economic reforms, which basically are attempting to maintain the hegemony of neoliberal capitalism. But all this requires, a lot of intellectual and cultural work. It's not just an economic strategy. And so it's in that spirit of that last slide that we'll be talking, about current developments in the history of American reform, how American reform got hijacked and subverted. And it's, I think, the second week in November. But anyway, the discussion, is obviously going to continue. And thank you so much for jump-starting this discussion and giving us some energy to talk about. So we'll see you all at noon. Thank you very much.